I won't be going too in-depth on the manga I'm going to be talking about today. I want to keep this video as short as possible and don't want to spoil too much going forward. Originally this video was going to focus on several manga, but I found one to be much more interesting than the others. That manga is obviously the subject of today's video. I've primarily only talked about anime and video games on this channel, but I'm hoping to change that. I want to branch out into other mediums of entertainment like film and television. I enjoy reading manga, but I will admit that I haven't read nearly as many as I'd have liked. While manga is more rewarding, I find it much easier to just sit down and watch some quality animated slop. Since this is technically my first foray into discussing manga on this channel, I'm going to preface that I'll probably say some dumb shit. I always try to research and read as much as I can, but I can be real stupid sometimes too. I'm obviously not qualified to talk critically about stuff. I just enjoy this nerd shit. Just wanted to put that out there before I get into anything. So the topic of today's video is the manga Freesia. It began publishing in Monthly Iki in 2001 and completed publication in 2009. It is, without a doubt, author Jiro Matsumoto's greatest work, and yet it has gone relatively unnoticed. This could just be because seinen is a less bankable demographic, or it might be because of Freesia's content. Personally, I think it's a mix of both. I read Freesia all the way back in 2017 and have been wanting to talk about it ever since. It was one of the first ones I ever read, and I picked it on a complete whim, most likely because up until then I'd only read manga that had adaptations that I'd either seen or was very much aware of. Freesia is weird, disturbing, surreal, violent, bleak, and can be so absurd that it becomes a really fucked up dark comedy at points, and I love it. This is by far the most chaotic and upsetting manga I've ever read. Upsetting in that the characters and scenes are depicted in a very cold, sometimes emotionless way. I have to preface that, because I've read Berserk and that shit clears any and all manga. While Berserk's miserable and disturbing moments exist to strengthen the characters and build on the setting, Freesia at times can feel very edgy and self-indulgent. Not all the violence and sexual deviance is without purpose, but it can feel very forced and aggressive, especially early on. This manga is a fucking fever dream of drugs, sex, and violence, and at the time the only other comparable thing I'd read was Gantz. Somehow Freesia makes that shit look like a comic book for children, and if you've read Gantz, that might sound like a pretty outlandish claim, but I stand by it. Out of curiosity, I also read a couple of the other works written by Jiro Matsumoto, and they're all like this. Tropical Citron is an insane drug trip from beginning to end. Content-wise, it's similar to Freesia, but the characters, setting, and themes are completely different. Plus, Freesia gets 12 volumes to play around with all sorts of insane ideas and scenarios, so there's a lot more going on. Tropical Citron also kinda feels like a mess, but I think that's intentional due to all the drug imagery and such. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but it was short and I didn't hate it. Anyways, this is the final content warning for the video. Freesia contains a lot of wild, batshit stuff, a fuckload of which can be extremely triggering. The manga literally opens on a rape scene. It's not done for shock value, but it's fucked nonetheless. So yes, Freesia contains a lot of graphic violence, sexual assault, drugs, very obscene and honestly disgusting sex scenes, and is, at its core, a story about broken, deranged characters committing morally questionable acts. It's definitely one of the more interesting mangas I've ever read. I love dystopian stories, and Freesia is an odd one. It's set in an alternate reality Japan that is engaged in a war. This war is kind of the catalyst for the whole story. Not only does it generate a lot of the psychos that make up our main cast of characters, but it also leads to the gimmick of this particular world. See, if you've watched or read or played enough dystopian media, then you'll notice some patterns, particularly with works coming out in the last 20 or so years. A lot of dystopian media will try to differentiate themselves with a simple gimmick. Hunger Games is Battle Royale for poor people. Tender as the Flesh is about cannibalism. Unwind is about child murder and organ harvesting. It's a hard one to describe. So what does Freesia do to separate itself? Well, it's set in a totalitarian Japan where an act of vengeance has been put in place, essentially allowing legal revenge killings. It's an immediately interesting concept, but very quickly starts to fall apart and feel a bit goofy the more you think about it. But Freesia somehow makes it work. These retaliation killings all go through the government. It's all treated in a very grounded and legal manner, much like receiving a court-appointed lawyer. One can choose to commit the retaliation murder themselves, or hire someone to do it for them. The main character, Kano, works for a firm specializing in retaliatory killings. And that's the basic premise. It should also be noted that while this is the basic setup for the story, Freesia does not focus much on the revenge aspect itself. The manga would much rather explore its characters rather than the dystopian elements that make up the setting. Minor spoilers going forward. If Freesia sounds at all interesting to you, then I advise stopping here. It's a crazy read, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. I actually recommend it, warts and all. I'll just get this out of the way now. Kano is schizophrenic. It's apparent from the very moment we're introduced to him that he's a little strange, but throughout the story his mental state spirals drastically out of control. Kano also exhibits a lot of antisocial behaviours and shows a clear disregard for personal relationships. He reminds me a lot of Jack from Fight Club or Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, in that he can sometimes be an unreliable narrator due to his mental illness. His point of view twists and warps the story and world in a really compelling way. At times, you feel like Kano as you read, and all around his character is just really well done. That being said, he is not the sort of character that I would trust with a fucking gun to go out and do legal revenge killings, but it makes for an entertaining story. Despite the fact that Kano talks to his phone and regularly has conversations with deceased characters and will randomly quote shit he's seen on TV like he's Chris Chan, he is somehow not the most fucked character in this story. Kano is actually relatively tame comparatively, but you wouldn't think that based on the way this manga opens. But you know what? It is engaging. One of the first things we see this character doing is fucking his crack addict looking ass girlfriend on top of his bedridden mother. Yeah, this shit's crazy. It would be totally understandable for most people to just drop this shit right there, and I did think about doing that. But I was curious, so I kept reading, and I'm glad I did. Freesia is a character study first and a dystopian thriller second. Its main focus is on analysing the host of demented characters and the morally grey situations they find themselves in. And the setting is almost dressing on top of that, as it mostly just informs some of the events and what the characters do/say, as opposed to being the source for all the conflict. Kano, throughout the course of the story, actually became a character I was deeply invested in, and one I kind of felt sorry for. He is easily the most interesting thing about this manga, the main driving force. His psyche is the most fascinating part about both his character and the manga overall, but his strange talents are what separate him from the rest of the cast. From serving in the military, he's somehow gained an active camouflage ability which enables him to seemingly alter people's perception of him. He almost seems alien with how he acts and reacts. Despite all the weird sex stuff with his girlfriend and the schizophrenic episodes, he is seemingly normal, at least in terms of Freesia's other characters. I'm not going to go into any of the villains, or whatever you want to call them, as well as side characters, but I will be discussing the main cast. Mizoguchi is absolutely deranged. When he's not beating the living daylights out of his girlfriend, he's performing the murder contracts with a big smile on his face, or just straight up hunting the other characters that work for the same firm, including Kano. He's an insane character who, if you plucked out of this story and dumped into the boys' graphic novel, he'd fit right in. And that's probably the best comparison I can think of for Freesia. It's the boys of manga. It's fucked, it's weird, it can be really silly, and it flip-flops between being hilariously fun and hard to read. Yamada is probably, at face value, the most normal character here. He's not that interesting and mainly serves as an audience surrogate, but I do like his overall character arc. I think he adds a lot to the other characters, placing an even greater spotlight on Kano as a weird, out-of-touch android and Mizoguchi as a deranged psychopath. The last of the central characters is Higuchi. She's not a field agent like the other three, instead handling all the paperwork for the firm and securing revenge contracts. She's a compelling enough character due to the mysterious and frankly depressing connection she has to Kano, which is hinted at very early on. Although I like her, she mostly exists to make Kano more complex and fascinating from an analytical perspective. This, for obvious reasons, is not the sort of manga you'd expect to get an anime adaptation, and I'm glad, because if they did, they'd probably just fuck it up with censorship and whatnot. To my surprise, there is actually a live-action film, but I have no idea of the quality of it. I might make a video out of it or something. That could be fun. Freesia is one of my favourite manga, and before I read Berserk, it was my favourite. For all the graphic violence, freaky sex acts, and abuse in all forms, there is equal parts genuine character development and analysis. It's a chaotic, hellish story about weird, fucked up psychos, and I think it's the most entertaining science fiction manga I've ever read. Even with all the perverse, disturbing baggage, it manages to say something, which is more than can be said for trite shit like Batum and a Kamiga Kill. And that's it. I wanted to keep this one kinda short because I don't know how interesting it'd be to just watch out of context manga pages fading across the screen, so hope it was okay. I want to do more things like this in the future. This is similar to the anime roundup video I just put out semi-recently, which I really enjoyed making. I've been wanting to do a video similar to that one, but focusing on films, for a very long time. I watch way more movies than anything, but I always feel unqualified to talk about film in any sort of capacity online. But I don't know, I talk about this shit to my friends all the time, and they're probably sick of hearing it, so maybe I should just commit and finally put out a video like that. Anyways, that's all for this video. -7 likes and I'll review my favorite anime, Nyan Neko Sugar Girls.